He is 8 years old, or perhaps 9, sitting on a flat stone near the garden wall of his family's house in Klein-Huningen, a small village on the edge of Basel where the Rhine moves slowly and the light in late afternoon falls at an angle that makes ordinary things look briefly ancient. His hands are resting in his lap, his eyes are half closed. The village sounds are there, a cart somewhere, birds, the distant movement of water, but they have receded to the edge of his attention, which is occupied with something he has no name for yet, and will spend the better part of a century trying to name. He is aware, in this moment, of being two people at once. There is the boy, Karl, the pastor's son, the child who goes to school and returns home and eats supper and knows the names of his neighbors. That boy is real. He walks around in the world and speaks and is spoken to and takes up space in rooms. But beneath that boy, or perhaps alongside him, or perhaps more accurately behind him, the way a shadow is behind a figure in morning light, there is something else, an interior presence. Something older than the century he was born in, older perhaps than the village, something that feels as though it has always existed and will go on existing after the boy on the stone wall has long since become a different person, or no person at all. Carl Gustav Jung would later call these two presences personality number 1 and personality number 2. He would describe them with great care in his memoirs, written when he was very old, and the care he took tells you something about how seriously he continued to hold the experience across all the intervening decades. Personality number 1 was the social self, the self that moved through the world, acquired skills and habits, managed relationships, earned its place in the ordinary human order of things. Personality number 2 was something harder to describe, an ancient interior figure, silent and vast without particular ambition, oriented toward depths rather than surfaces, with a quality of permanence that personality number 1 entirely lacked. Most children who feel something like this have no way to hold it. The experience moves through them and dissolves back into ordinary life. What was unusual about the boy on the stone wall was not that he felt it, but that he held it, turned it over, sat with it, returned to it, the way one returns to a dream that refuses to finish long after waking. The distinction he was fumbling toward in those quiet afternoon hours would reappear many years later as a philosophical cornerstone of everything he built. The ego, that lit, occupied, manageable self that goes about its daily business, was real, but it was not the whole of a person. Behind it, beneath it, surrounding it on all sides like countryside surrounds a town, there was more. The question of what that more contained, and how a person might come to know it, and what the knowing might cost, and what it might give, those questions would follow him from that stone wall to the end of a long, strange, difficult, extraordinarily productive life. The Rhine moved somewhere below the garden. The afternoon light continued its slow descent. The boy sat still for a while longer, aware of both of his selves, then got up and went inside for supper, where he was Karl, and only Karl, and the other thing retreated to wherever it waited when the world required his full attention. His father was a pastor of the Swiss Reformed Church, a man named Johann Paul Achilles Jung, called Paul, who served a parish first in Kesswil on Lake Constance, where Karl was born in 1875, and then in Laufen, and then in Klein-Huningen, where the boy on the stone wall spent his childhood. Paul Ewing was a scholar who had once been genuinely interested in theological questions, who had read seriously and thought carefully, and entered the church with something more than professional intention. By the time his son was old enough to sit in the pews and watch him preach, something had changed. The scholarship remained, the words remained, but behind the words, audible to a child who had already learned to listen to what was underneath things, there was a faint tremor of uncertainty, a slight instability in the foundations that the familiar liturgical structures were doing their best to cover over. Carl sat in those pews and heard the tremor. He was not yet old enough to name what he was hearing, but he felt it the way a child feels the difference between a door that is genuinely closed and a door that is merely shut, the first secure, the second carrying in its slight vibration the possibility of opening. His father was a man whose faith had been inherited, learned, worn into habit, believed in the way most people believe things, acceptably, functionally, without the undergirding of direct experience that might have made the belief into something alive rather than something carried. The philosophical problem this introduced into the boy's life was not one he formulated consciously, but it lodged in him and worked its way deeper over the years, and by the time he was old enough to look back at it clearly, he could see what the question had been. There is a difference between a belief arrived at through received tradition and a belief arrived at through direct encounter with the thing the tradition points toward. His father had the first. The tradition gave it shape, gave it words, gave it a structure that could be passed from parent to child and community to community across generations. But direct encounter, whatever numinous experience might mean, whatever the tradition's rituals were originally designed to cultivate, that was another thing entirely, and it could not be inherited, and it could not be argued into being, and when it was absent, even the most sincere performance of its forms carried a hollowness that was perceptible to anyone listening carefully. The son would spend a life trying to understand this distinction. He would eventually argue that the crisis of meaning afflicting the modern world was not primarily an intellectual problem, but an experiential one, not that people had been given bad arguments for belief, but that they had been given forms without the living content. The forms were made to carry. His father's slightly trembling sermons were the first place he encountered this idea, in the form it would stay with him, not as an abstraction, but as something heard in a specific room, from a specific man, on specific winter mornings, when the light through the church windows fell cold and the words rose and fell in their familiar rhythm, and something was almost but not quite there. Paul Jung died in 1896, when Carl was 21 and a medical student at the University of Basel. The two of them had never managed to speak honestly about what had happened to the father's faith, or about the son's questions, which by then had become large and various, and not easily set aside. There is something in the timing that has the quality of an incomplete sentence, a conversation that kept finding reasons not to happen, cut off before it could find its subject. What it left in Jung was not simply grief, but a clarification that the questions his father could not answer would fall to him, and that he would have to find his way toward them by a different route than inherited tradition had available to offer. In the early years of the 20th century, a young Swiss psychiatrist practicing in Zurich began reading the work of a Viennese neurologist, whose ideas were then circulating at the edges of European medicine, treated with roughly equal parts fascination and suspicion. The neurologist was Sigmund Freud. The ideas concerned the unconscious, the territory below the threshold of conscious awareness that Freud had identified as the source of neurotic symptoms, the engine of dreams, the great repository of everything the waking mind had found too difficult to look at directly. Jung read Freud's asterisk, the interpretation of dreams asterisk, with the quality of attention he gave to things that mattered to him, which was considerable. He found in it a genuine seriousness, a willingness to treat the strange contents of mental life as something more than noise, a framework that took the interior seriously as territory worth mapping. He began writing to Freud. By 1906, the correspondence had become a genuine intellectual exchange, and in 1907, Jung traveled to Vienna to meet the older man in person. They talked for 13 hours. By most accounts, including Jung's own, there was an immediate recognition between them, not merely professional, but something warmer and more complicated. The recognition two unusual minds sometimes experience when they understand that the other is working on a problem of comparable difficulty and comparable seriousness. Freud, 20 years older, saw in Jung a potential heir, someone who might carry the project forward, who had the ability and the energy and the training. Jung, for his part, saw in Freud a figure whose intelligence was genuine and whose courage in facing the contents of the unconscious was real, even if the particular map he was drawing had boundaries that seemed too narrow in places. The warmth was real, and it contained, as warmth sometimes does when it forms too quickly between two people of genuinely different natures, the precise shape of the eventual fracture. The intellectual disagreement that would eventually separate them had been present from nearly the beginning, held in suspension by mutual respect and mutual usefulness. At its core, the disagreement was this: Freud understood the unconscious primarily as a reservoir of repressed material, specifically of wishes and conflicts rooted in the biological instincts, above all the sexual drive, whose frustrated or thwarted expression generated the symptoms he had spent his career learning to read. The unconscious was, in this account, essentially personal, formed from an individual's particular history, their particular repressions, their particular encounters with the prohibitions that social life imposes on biological nature. Jung agreed that the personal unconscious was real. He had evidence enough for it in his clinical practice, in the strange autonomous figures that erupted into his patients' lives, in the dreams that carried the compressed history of individual experience in the form of image and narrative. But he had also begun to notice something that did not fit comfortably inside Freud's framework. He was seeing, in his patient's material, symbolic patterns that seemed too structurally consistent across too many different people with too many different personal histories to be explained by individual repression alone. He was encountering images and figures and narrative structures that appeared across cultures separated by geography and time in ways that suggested not personal history, but something shared, a deeper layer below the personal, inherited rather than acquired, belonging not to an individual, but to humanity as such. The disagreement sharpened over the years and came to a head with the publication, in 1912, of a book Jung had been working on through considerable internal struggle. The book was called Symbols of Transformation, and in it Jung laid out an extended argument about the nature of psychic energy, libido, as Freud called it, that departed significantly from Freud's understanding. Freud had understood libido as specifically sexual energy, and had read the great mythological and symbolic productions of human culture as expressions of this essentially biological drive, displaced or transformed. Jung looked at the same material and found this explanation insufficient. What he saw in myth and symbol was not displaced sexuality, but something more general, a psychic energy that could take sexual form but was not limited to it, that expressed itself in the full range of human creative and spiritual life, and that could not be reduced to its biological substrate without losing what was most philosophically interesting about it. The book also introduced, carefully and with a certain amount of scholarly scaffolding, the The suggestion that the deeper layer of the unconscious Jung was encountering in his patient's material was not personal, but transpersonal, not assembled from the material of an individual life, but inherited as a structural feature of the psyche, present in human beings, the way certain anatomical features are present, not acquired but given. The question of what this layer contained, how it functioned, and what it meant for the practice of psychology would occupy the next 4 decades of his working life. But in 1912, when the book was published, it functioned first as the decisive announcement of a disagreement. Freud read the book before publication. The two men exchanged letters. The letters grew shorter and cooler. By 1913, the correspondence had effectively ended, and with it the collaboration, and with it a friendship that had been genuine enough on both sides to make the ending genuinely painful. The intellectual consequences were serious on both sides. For Freud, the loss of Jung meant the loss of someone he had, perhaps unwisely, already begun to designate as a successor and crown prince. For Jung, the loss of Freud meant the loss of a framework that had been providing, even with its limitations, a kind of theoretical scaffolding for work he was only beginning to understand. He was left standing in open ground, the old map inadequate, and the new one not yet drawn. What happened to Jung in the years that followed the break is one of the more carefully documented cases of a serious thinker choosing to face the contents of their own interior life with deliberate and methodical attention, under conditions of considerable personal difficulty, without flinching away from what the attention revealed. He continued his clinical practice. He continued to think and to write, but he also began, in the evenings and on weekends, to descend. He had been having, since childhood, an inner life of unusual richness and strangeness, dreams of considerable vividness, interior figures that presented themselves with something approaching the solidity of real presences, fantasies that were not mere daydreaming, but active, populated, narratively coherent encounters with something that felt to him genuinely other. In the years after 1913, he decided to engage this material deliberately and methodically, rather than simply observing it from the edges. He began what he would later call active imagination, in a practice of deliberately entering into the imagery of the unconscious, holding it in focused attention, allowing it to develop and move and speak, and then engaging with it, not as an observer, but as a participant, questioning, responding, following the figures where they led. The practice was not therapy, precisely. It was something closer to a philosophical method, a first-person investigation into the nature of the interior landscape, conducted with the same seriousness a naturalist might bring to the investigation of an unmapped coast. Edmund Husserl, working at roughly the same time in Germany, had argued that philosophy needed to return to direct experience and describe what appeared in consciousness with rigorous attention, setting aside inherited theoretical frameworks in order to see clearly what was actually there. Jung's active imagination was something like this, applied not to the general structures of conscious experience, but to the specific, strange, autonomous contents of the unconscious, the figures and images and narratives that arose not from intention, but from below intention, carrying meanings that conscious deliberation had not placed there. The fruits of this period were gathered into a large handmade book, bound in red leather, into which Jung copied his visions and dialogues and painted the images he encountered with careful, accomplished brushstrokes. He called it the Red Book. It was not a theoretical document. It was more like the record of a journey, specific, first person, full of figures Jung did not invent but encountered, full of landscapes he had not imagined in advance, but found when he descended far enough. One of the central figures was an old man named Philomel, who appeared with the wings of a kingfisher and who carried a quality of wisdom that Jung explicitly identified as superior to his own, as coming from somewhere other than his own knowledge and intentions, representing, as he later put it, a psychic function autonomous from consciousness, something the interior contained that was not the ego and not merely its projection, but something genuinely other, genuinely there, capable of instruction. The philosophical implications of this were considerable. If the psyche contained figures that were not merely disguised fragments of the ego's own knowledge and wishes, but genuinely autonomous presences with their own perspectives and their own authority, then the psyche was a more complex and more interesting thing than either Freud's hydraulics of repression or the ordinary assumption of a unified conscious self had allowed for. It was, Jung began to think, more like a landscape than like a room. It had its lit clearing, the ego, conscious, articulate, purposive, but it also had vast surrounding territory that the light from the clearing did not reach, territory that had its own inhabitants and its own logic and its own movements, and that could not be understood by analogy to anything the lit clearing contained. This image, the psyche as landscape, consciousness as a lit clearing within it, the surrounding dark, not hostile, but simply larger and otherwise, is not a metaphor Jung uses once or twice for rhetorical effect. It is close to the center of what he actually believed about the nature of mind, arrived at not by theoretical argument alone, but by the combination of clinical observation and direct interior investigation that the Red Book years represented. The hydraulic model he inherited from Freud, the mind as a pressurized system of forces pushing against barriers and finding outlets, said something true about certain psychological phenomena, but it was too mechanical, and it was too small, and it lacked the dimension Jung kept encountering in his patients and in himself. The sense that the psyche was oriented towards something, that it had a direction as well as a pressure, that it was not merely discharging tension, but trying, with considerable patience and considerable indirection, to move towards something like wholeness. The difference between these two pictures of the mind is not only clinical, it is philosophical, and it goes deep. A mind governed entirely by pressure and discharge is at bottom a mind governed by necessity, by forces it did not choose and cannot ultimately redirect, playing out their dynamics according to a logic that has no interest in what the person containing them would prefer. A mind that is also oriented toward wholeness, that has alongside its driven and pressured and defended aspects something like a telos, a direction, a pull toward a completeness it has not yet achieved, is a different kind of thing. It has a relationship to possibility that the purely hydraulic model does not allow. The question of which picture is truer is not one that can be settled by argument alone. It is the kind of question that different lives answer differently, in the long run, by what they find when they look carefully and honestly enough. At his desk in those years after 1913, the lamp burning, the large red book open before him, Jung was not settling a theoretical question. He was doing something more primary, descending into territory that he had not entered deliberately before, and trying to record what he found there with the accuracy and the patience the territory deserved. The figures he encountered, Philemon and a dark woman who called herself his soul, and others, were not his inventions. They arrived, they spoke, they had things to say that surprised him and that he could not always immediately understand. And alongside the strangeness, alongside the difficulty, alongside the occasional vertigo of sitting alone at a desk in a house near Zurich in the early decades of the 20th century and conducting earnest dialogues with interior presences. Alongside all of this, there was something else, the steady, quiet sense of a man who had chosen not to turn away from the interior, but toward it. The choice was not dramatic. It did not announce itself as a heroic or a desperate decision. It was more like the choice to keep walking on a path that has become difficult, not because the difficulty promises a known reward, but because the alternative, turning back, returning to the surface, treating the interior as something to be managed rather than entered, felt like a betrayal of something more important than comfort. He had noticed the two presences since childhood, sitting on the stone wall near the Rhine. He had watched his father lose contact with the living dimension of the tradition he carried. He had parted from the most intellectually serious colleague he had ever known over the question of whether the psyche had depths that could not be accounted for by the personal history of the person who contained them. And now he was alone with the question, in a red book by lamplight, and he was going deeper rather than away. The going deeper was not a solution, it was a beginning. What he would find there, and what his years of descent would eventually allow him to understand about the structure of the psyche, about the figures that inhabited it, about the long and difficult process by which a human being might come to be more fully and honestly what they most deeply were. All of that was still ahead, still unmapped, still waiting in the territory the lamp had not yet reached. But the choice to go in rather than retreat, to treat the interior as something that deserved the same quality of honest attention one would bring to any other serious inquiry, to sit with the figures and listen to what they had to say rather than explaining them away as symptoms or noise. That choice, made quietly, without ceremony, at a desk in Küsnacht in the years just after the First World War was beginning to change the shape of Europe, was not a small one. It never is. The interior does not demand entry. It simply waits, in the way that unmapped territory waits, patient, unchanged by being ignored, always there, always available, always offering to the person who chooses to turn toward it the same thing it has always had to offer, the genuine, difficult, irreplaceable country of what one most deeply is. The lamp burned, the red book lay open. Outside the window, the night was quiet and very old, and the Rhine was moving somewhere in the dark, the way it had been moving when a boy sat near it on a flat stone with his eyes half closed, feeling without yet having the words for it, the ancient and persistent strangeness of being alive, of being this person, and also something that the name Karl had never quite contained. Jung was at his desk in Küsnacht in the early morning, his notebook open before him, drawing a circle, not with a compass or a ruler, with the slow, steady movement of his hand following something his hand already knew. The circle was not quite perfect, and he did not try to correct it. Inside the circle, he drew smaller forms, petals, divisions, a center point, and then he sat looking at what he had made with the same quiet attention he gave to everything that came from below the level of intention. He had been doing this for years. Each morning, before the day's work began, before the patients arrived at the gate of the large lakeside house, before the letters and the arguments and the theoretical obligations of being who he had become, before all of that, there was this, the hand moving, the circle arriving, the form completing itself on the page. He did not always know what the forms meant. He treated not knowing as a form of patience rather than a deficiency. The notebook on that desk was not a journal in any ordinary sense. It was closer to a survey, the way a careful person surveys unfamiliar land, recording what is present, marking what is notable, not yet deciding what it all means. The land Jung was surveying was the psyche, not as an abstract entity, not as a clinical category, but as an actual territory with actual features, with its own geography, its own depths and surfaces, and hidden currents, its own interior weather. The circle he drew each morning was one way of making that territory visible, or at least legible, at least for a moment, before the day closed over it again. This is where the map must begin. The first thing to understand about Jung's account of the psyche is what the ego is, and perhaps more importantly, what it is not. In ordinary experience, the ego feels like everything. It is the voice that narrates the day, the sense of being a continuous self who has been here before and will be here tomorrow, the organizing center around which plans form and memories arrange themselves. To the ego, from the inside, it feels like the whole of consciousness. Jung's patient observation suggested something quieter and more unsettling, that the ego is real and central to conscious life and genuinely necessary, but that it is not the whole, and it did not make itself. An island is still useful to a traveler, even if it is not the ocean. The ego is the place where a person stands, the lit ground beneath the feet, warm and solid and familiar. From the island, everything nearby is visible: the day's tasks, the relationships, the memories most recently visited, the plans most recently made. The island is sufficient for almost everything ordinary life requires. The question Jung kept returning to was not whether the island was real, but whether the water surrounding it was. The water was real. That was his claim, and he spent the better part of a working life describing its currents. And beneath the lit clearing of the ego, Jung understood there to be a second layer, the personal unconscious, the accumulated material of a single individual's experience. Here are the things one has forgotten, or chosen not to remember, or never quite allowed into full awareness. Here are the emotional residues of old encounters, the attitudes toward authority, learned in childhood and never examined, the fears shaped by experiences the conscious mind has long since filed and moved past. The personal unconscious is not exotic, it is intimate. It is composed of the contents of a single life, pressed into the dark by the ordinary mechanisms of forgetting and suppression and selective attention. What makes it interesting, philosophically interesting, not merely clinically interesting, is that these contents do not stay passive. They organize around particularly charged emotional experiences, around old wounds or old yearnings or old shames. The material of the personal unconscious clusters into structures Jung called complexes. A complex is not a single memory. It is a kind of gravitational center around which associated material has been gathering for years, accumulating mass, developing its own predictable patterns of response. Touch the complex and it responds, not as the ego would respond, deliberately and proportionately, but in its own way, with its own emotional velocity. Someone who grew up with an unpredictable parent may carry a complex around authority that activates whenever a supervisor uses a certain tone of voice. The activation is not chosen. It arrives before the conscious mind has quite decided how to react, flooding the ordinary space of response with something that feels urgent and large, something disproportionate to the actual moment. From the outside, this can look like overreaction. From the inside, it feels entirely warranted. The complex does not consult the ego before it speaks. This was what interested the psychologist Pierre Janet before Jung. the phenomenon of unconscious fixed ideas that could operate autonomously, independently of conscious intention, as though a second will were present in the same person. Jung inherited this observation and extended it substantially, understanding complexes not as pathological anomalies, but as ordinary features of the psychic landscape, as natural and as inevitable as the fact that old soil holds more moisture than new. The personal unconscious for Jung is not evidence of damage, it is evidence of a life that has been lived long enough to accumulate itself. And beneath the personal unconscious, beneath the accumulated material of this particular life, in this particular body, in this particular century, Jung understood there to be something else, something that did not begin with a birth and would not end with a death, something that was not the inheritance of any single person, but the inheritance of a species. He called it the collective unconscious, and it remains his most philosophically ambitious and most philosophically debated contribution. The collective unconscious is not composed of personal experience. Its contents were never conscious in any individual, or never learned, or never forgotten. They are inherited, not in the way a piece of furniture is inherited, passing from hand to hand through historical time, but in the way an eye is inherited, or a hand, or the capacity for language, as a structural feature of the organism, present before experience begins, shaping the form that experience will take. The collective unconscious is the deep aquifer beneath the particular wells of individual lives, each well different in character and in taste, each drawing from the same water that has been accumulating in the dark since before any particular person drew their first breath. The evidence Jung found most compelling was the kind that conventional explanation struggled to absorb. Patients with no classical education produced, in their dreams and in acute states, imagery that matched closely the symbolism of ancient mystery religions they had no access to. Similar symbolic structures appeared in Babylonian creation myth, in West African ceremonial art, in the spontaneous drawings of Swiss children, in the visions reported by medieval mystics. The structures were not identical in their surface details. The imagery varied with culture and with century, but underneath the surface variation there was a consistency of shape, a recurring logic, that Jung understood as too systematic to be attributed to historical borrowing or cultural transmission. This is where Jung steps into proximity with Plato, though he would have approached the comparison carefully. Plato argued that the particular instances of beauty, or justice, or goodness, visible in the world participate in something more fundamental, forms or ideas that the particular instances approximate without ever fully capturing. Jung was not making a metaphysical claim about forms existing independently of minds, but his observation that certain symbolic structures appear consistently across cultures and centuries, shaped by the same underlying pattern, is a philosophical claim with structural similarity, that beneath the particular expressions there is something shared, something that is not the product of any individual's imagination, but the ground within which individual imagination operates. He was disciplined about what he would claim. The archetype itself, the underlying structural principle, was not available to direct observation. It was something like Kant's thing in itself, the thing as it is before the mind has shaped it into what can be experienced. What was available was the archetypal image, the particular form the archetype took in this culture, in this century, in this patient's dream. The image is observable. The archetype is inferred. Jung held this distinction carefully, because without it, the entire enterprise risked sliding from careful description into speculation, and speculation was not what he thought the psyche needed. The archetypes have no face of their own. They acquire faces through the culture and the individual life that receives them. The mother archetype does not wear one face. It wears every face that any culture has given to the fundamental experience of origin, of nourishment, of the source that precedes and exceeds the individual. The hero does not follow one story. It follows the deep shape of a story, the departure, the ordeal, the return that repeats itself in forms as different as a Greek tragedy and a Polynesian navigation myth, and a dream in which a school teacher finds herself standing at the edge of an unknown country she did not choose and cannot explain. A hooded figure stands at the edge of a forest, not threatening, not welcoming, simply present, with the patience of something that has no particular relationship to human urgency or human time. This figure appears in dreams across centuries, Jung's patients in Zurich, pilgrims in medieval manuscripts, initiates in Egyptian mystery schools who were asked to describe what they had encountered in the underworld. The specific features differ. The quality of presence is the same, something ancient and interior, waiting with the particular stillness of something that has been waiting long enough to have lost all anxiety about the wait. The archetypes do not announce themselves. They work through the images and stories and figures that catch the attention and refuse to let go, the myths that feel true in a way that exceeds their literal content, the dreams that leave a residue days after the dreaming, the stories told across cultures that seem to mean something more than their plots. The archetype is not the story, it is the structural requirement that makes the story feel necessary. Among the figures that populate the collective unconscious, two drew Jung's sustained attention in a way that distinguished them from the others, not because they were more ancient or more powerful, but because they stood in a particular relationship to the ego, at once deeply intimate and deeply foreign. These were the figures Jung called the anima and the animus. In a man, the anima is the interior feminine figure, not woman as she exists in the external world, but the image of the feminine as it lives within the male psyche, shaped partly by the inherited structure of the archetype and partly by the actual women the man has known, beginning with the first and most formative. In a woman, the animus is the interior masculine figure, the image of the masculine as it lives within the female psyche, with the same dual inheritance of the archetypal and the personal. These descriptions require a pause because they are easy to misread. Jung was not suggesting that men are feminine in ways that need to be hidden, or that women are secretly masculine in ways that need to be explained. He was making a more careful and more interesting observation that the psyche of each person contains within itself something genuinely foreign to its conscious self-identification, something that does not share the ego's sense of who and what it is. This inner otherness is not an error and not a problem. It is, in Jung's view, a structural feature of the psyche that serves a specific purpose as a bridge between the ego and the deeper layers of the unconscious, a figure who knows the interior territory in ways the ego does not and cannot. When the anima or animus remains unrecognized, when a person lives without any awareness that this figure exists, it does not disappear. It operates from behind, projecting itself outward. A man who has not yet encountered his anima within himself will tend to find her everywhere outside, concentrated in particular women who seem to carry an extraordinary quality, a luminosity or depth or creative sorrow that appears inexplicable and irresistible. The quality is not invented. It is real, but it is being perceived in the world because it has not yet been found inside. What he finds compelling in her is in part his own unlived inner life, waiting to be recognized. there is something philosophically serious in this observation beyond its clinical usefulness. The encounter with genuine inner otherness, with a figure inside oneself that does not share one's assumptions, does not see the world through the same aperture, brings a fundamentally different orientation to any question the ego puts to it, is not available everywhere. It is available in the Jungian understanding, here, in the interior, in the figures that the collective unconscious delivers upward through dream and image, and the inexplicable weight of certain encounters. The most important relationship in a life may not be the ones conducted in the external world, visible to others, susceptible to ordinary understanding. Some of the most consequential conversations happen entirely within. Return now to the ego, not to diminish it, but to place it accurately. The ego is the center of consciousness. This is a genuine description, not merely a figure of speech. The ego is where experience is organized, where decisions are weighed, where the narrative of a life is maintained. It is the necessary foundation of functional, oriented existence. Without a sufficiently stable ego, a person cannot maintain the sense of temporal continuity or personal coherence that daily life requires. Jung was not disparaging the ego when he declined to call it the totality of the psyche. He was describing its actual position more precisely. The philosophical consequence of this positioning is not trivial. If the ego is the center of consciousness, but not the totality of the psyche, then there are forces operating within the psyche that the ego did not choose and cannot simply command. The complex that erupts in the middle of an ordinary conversation is not obeying the ego's instructions. The dream that arrives with its own imagery and its own logic is not being directed by conscious intention. The archetype that surfaces in a moment of unusual emotional intensity is drawing on a reservoir the ego did not fill. All of this activity is real, consequential, and to a significant degree autonomous. This autonomy is the philosophically difficult part. The tradition of Western rationalism, in its most confident forms, has tended to locate the seat of genuine human agency in precisely the ego, the reflective, deliberating, self-aware conscious mind. What Descartes called the thinking substance, what Kant called the transcendental unity of apperception, the self that is present to itself, in reflection, and on whose clear-sighted judgment everything else depends. If Jung is right that this self is not the whole, that it is surrounded by territory it did not make and cannot fully map, then the picture of human agency that the rationalist tradition relied on requires at minimum a significant qualification. This is not a picture Jung presented with alarm, and the unconscious, in his account, is not an adversary. It is more like the larger part of the house in which the ego has been living primarily in one room. The other rooms are not empty. They are furnished, inhabited, in use. They have their own purposes and their own logic. The ego that remains in its single room and calls that the whole house is simply operating on incomplete information. The information that the other rooms contain may be inconvenient, or it may be exactly what is needed. Either way, it is there. A complex erupting unexpectedly in an ordinary conversation is a good place to let this rest for a moment. A person who believed themselves calm is suddenly flooded. A disproportionate anger arrives, or a grief that has no evident source in the present room, or a fear that the situation does not warrant. Something is speaking that was not invited into the conversation. From the outside, the eruption looks like a breach of composure. From a Jungian perspective, it is a communication, not a well-timed or well-organized one, but a communication nonetheless. Something in the interior is pressing for attention, and has found the only route available to it. The question this raises is not how to suppress the eruption, but what it is trying to say. That question is the beginning of a different kind of relationship with the interior, not the relationship of a warden with a difficult prisoner, but something closer to the relationship of a careful observer with a territory that has its own authority and its own knowledge. The complex attended to, rather than managed, tends to become less disruptive over time, not because it has been overcome, but because it has been heard. This is not a therapeutic technique in the narrow sense. It is a philosophical stance toward the parts of oneself that the ego did not choose and cannot dissolve. What does the collective unconscious feel like from the inside when something archetypal is moving? The question is genuinely difficult to answer because the experience is not easy to distinguish clearly from intense personal emotion. But those who have tried to describe it often reach for the same words, a sense of something larger than personal, a quality of weight or necessity in the image or the encounter that exceeds what the personal biography accounts for. A dream that does not feel like personal material, that arrives from a different distance, with a different gravity, as though the images were not generated by this life's particular history, but received from elsewhere. The elsewhere, in Jung's account, is the collective layer, the deep inheritance of the species, rather than the accumulated history of the individual. This elsewhere is not supernatural, in Jung's careful use of that term. It is not outside the psyche. It is simply the part of the psyche that is older than any single person, that was here before this particular consciousness arrived, and will outlast it, that carries within its structures the residue of everything the species has encountered and survived and made meaning from across the long centuries of human existence. In the early morning light, at Kusnacht, Jung's hand was still moving on the page. The circle he had drawn was complete. Inside it, the smaller forms had settled into their arrangement, not quite symmetrical, but balanced in some way that the eye recognized as satisfying without being able to fully explain. He looked at it for a long time. The morning light was coming through the study window at a low angle, falling across the notebook at a slight tilt, and the shadow of the pen he had set down lay across the lower portion of the circle like a line dividing it. He did not add anything more. The drawing was what it was. He closed the notebook and sat for a moment in the particular quiet of early morning before the day begins, that interval when the house is still and the lake is visible through the window and the interior life has not yet been replaced by the demands of the external one. In that interval, something of the night's work in the unconscious was still faintly available, like warmth that has not yet fully dispersed from a room where a fire was burning. This was the architecture he had spent his working life mapping, not an imposed structure, not a theoretical convenience, but a description of what he found when he looked carefully and long enough. The ego at the center of its lit clearing, the personal unconscious, with its complexes and its stored emotional weight, radiating out from that center. The collective unconscious at the deepest reach, impersonal and ancient, organized around structural forms that no individual life had produced. And in the middle depth, between the familiar and the impersonal, the interior figures, among them the anima and the animus, that serve as guides through the transition, as the territories deeper in become available to the consciousness that is willing to move through them. The architecture is not a destination, it is a place to begin. To understand that the ego is real without being complete, that the personal unconscious holds the specific residue of a specific life, that the collective unconscious carries the older inheritance of something much more than any individual. To understand, this is not to have finished anything. It is to have looked at the house and realized, perhaps for the first time, how many rooms it has, what is in those rooms, what they might contain, what they might offer, what they have been holding in the dark without complaint, for years, for decades, waiting with the patience that seems to be a characteristic feature of everything the unconscious holds. The anima, or the animus, stands just inside a door. Not the first door, not the door directly visible from the room where the ego has been spending its days. A door further in, set into a wall that the conscious self had perhaps noticed without quite registering what it was. The figure on the other side of the door is not a stranger, though it will feel like one. It belongs to the same interior. It was always part of the same house. The most consequential conversations, the ones that actually change the shape of what is known and what is possible, may be the ones that happen when that door is finally, quietly opened. Jung was sitting quietly across from a patient in his consulting room in Zurich, sometime in the early 1930s. The room was warm. The patient had just described a dream and then immediately waved it away. Something about the gesture suggesting not forgetfulness, but a kind of preemptive dismissal, as though the dream were a minor embarrassment rather than a message worth attending to. Jung said nothing for a moment. Then he leaned forward very slightly, a small movement, barely noticeable, and asked what the central figure in the dream had been doing with its hands. It was a small question. It was also, in its way, the whole of what Jung believed about the inner life, that the details mattered, that the figures appearing in sleep were not noise to be filtered out, but presences to be received, that whatever arose from below the surface of ordinary waking thought arrived for a reason, in a specific form, with a specific quality of attention waiting to be met. The figure's hands, not the figure's name or origin or meaning, its hands, the most particular and unremarkable detail, the one the patient had almost certainly not remembered on their own. That particular quality of attention was not accidental to Jung's psychology. It was its method, and it rested on a philosophical claim that ran much deeper than technique, the claim that the inner life has its own direction, its own movement, its own form of knowing what it is doing, even when the person who contains it does not. This is the claim at the center of what Jung called individuation. The word itself is plain enough. It derives from the Latin asterisk individuum, asterisk, that which cannot be divided, the particular, irreducible thing that it is. And what Jung meant by individuation was, in its simplest form, the process of becoming that, the particular, indivisible individual one most deeply is. Not the person one has been shaped to appear to be by circumstances and expectation and careful social navigation, not the person one would prefer to be if preferences were freely chosen, the person one actually is at the deepest available level of honest inquiry, the process of moving toward that person, however slowly, however incompletely, through the whole length of a life. It sounds almost modest when stated that plainly. It is not modest at all. A philosophical tradition running from Aristotle forward had understood living things as oriented toward their own fullest expression. Aristotle had observed that the acorn does not become a stone, it becomes an oak. Something in the form of the acorn is already a kind of direction, a built-in orientation toward what the thing will become when the conditions that allow it to grow are met. He called this entelechy, the having of an end within oneself. And though the direct application to human psychology is his own, Jung's understanding of the psyche carries something of this older intuition, that the person is not a random accumulation of experiences and reactions, but a particular form seeking its own realization. pressing quietly from within toward a specific kind of completion that only it and no other person is oriented to achieve. Leibniz, several centuries after Aristotle, had thought along lines that moved even closer to Jung's eventual position. Each monad in Leibniz's philosophy was a self-contained unit of experience, expressing the whole of the world from its own singular angle, irreducible to any other. No two monads were identical. Each carried within it a perspective that was its own and could not be shared. What individuation asks of a person, in Jung's sense, is something analogous, not to become universal, not to dissolve into a general human ideal, but to inhabit fully and honestly the particular window onto existence that only this person, born in this place, living this life, carrying this specific arrangement of gifts and wounds, is positioned to open. The difficulty is that very few people begin the second half of their lives having done this. Most have done the opposite, and have had good reasons for doing so. The first half of life has its own work. That work involves building. A person learns to function, to adapt, to find a place within the social world, to develop the skills and attitudes that allow them to survive and be recognized. They construct what Jung called the persona, the face presented to others, the socially legible version of the self that knows how to navigate what is required. This is not false, it is necessary. A person without any capacity for social adaptation has not solved the problem of the self. They have merely refused one version of it. The persona earns its place, but the persona is a partial thing. It is built by emphasizing certain qualities and suppressing others, by developing what fits and setting aside what does not, by making a coherent surface from the most useful materials available. What is set aside does not disappear. It accumulates quietly in the interior space that the construction of the persona has left in the dark. The question the second half of life eventually puts, sometimes gently, sometimes less gently, is whether the person who built that capable social surface is the whole story of who this particular human being is. And very often, with a quality of discomfort that cannot always be immediately named, the answer that arrives from somewhere below the level of considered opinion is not quite. This is the moment at which individuation, in Jung's sense, either begins or does not. The first threshold it asks anyone to cross is the one that leads toward the shadow. The shadow is not a concept that requires dramatic framing. It is, in its simplest form, the collection of qualities, impulses, and capacities that have not been admitted into the lit clearing of conscious self-presentation. Some of what lives there was set aside early for reasons that made sense at the time. Some of it was never developed at all. Some of it is genuinely difficult. The anger one has decided to call composure. The envy one has decided to call indifference. The hunger for recognition one has presented even to oneself as disinterest in external approval. The shadow is not evil, though it contains things that feel uncomfortable to acknowledge. It is simply everything that did not fit through the gate of the persona, left standing outside. The philosophical problem with this is old. Socrates had articulated something close to it in the 5th century before the Common Era. The observation that the unexamined life was not worth living, that genuine virtue could not be constructed on a foundation of self-ignorance, that the person who had not looked honestly at what they were actually doing and why was not merely uninformed, but was operating at a fundamental disadvantage relative to their own intentions. Much later, the French philosopher Simone Weil would write about affliction and the condition of genuine moral attention, with a related insistence that what a person refuses to see in themselves does not thereby cease to operate in them. It continues, but without the regulation that honest acknowledgement makes possible. Jung made a similar claim. The unacknowledged shadow does not stay quiet. It appears in the world as projection, as the qualities one finds most objectionable in other people, which are, with a regularity that borders on the mechanical, qualities one has most thoroughly refused to locate in oneself. The person who has decided they are not angry will tend to notice the anger in others with a particular sharpness of attention. The person who has suppressed their competitive instincts entirely will find themselves surrounded, as if by accident, by people whose competitiveness seems especially pronounced and especially offensive. The shadow does not wait to be invited back in. It shows up in the room by other means. The recognition Jung asked of his patients and of himself was not an act of self-condemnation. That is important. The shadow encounter, as he understood it, is not a trial or a confession or a verdict. It is, at its best, a moment of quiet acknowledgement, the recognition that what one had attributed entirely to the outside world has, all along, also been a feature of one's own interior territory. The quality one found insufferable in someone across a room, the reaction one had to a comment that should not have landed as hard as it did, the resentment that accumulated in a situation one had assured oneself was entirely fine. In those moments, not dramatic, not theatrical, often very ordinary, something is being offered, the chance to see rather than to attribute, the chance to own rather than to project. It is a small movement, and it changes the interior landscape in ways that are difficult to describe and not at all difficult to feel. This is what shadow recognition looks like when it actually happens, as distinct from when it is merely agreed to as a theoretical possibility. It looks like a moment of stillness. A person sees, perhaps in the middle of an ordinary conversation, that the contempt they have been directing outward has a source closer to home than they had assumed, and they do not look away. That not looking away is the whole thing. It is, as moral gestures go, quiet and unremarkable. It is also, as shifts in the organization of a life go, not small. The Socratic comparison holds in this respect too. Socrates had made self-knowledge the beginning of philosophy, but he was careful about what he thought that knowledge was for. It was not for self-improvement in the modern sense, not for optimization or the correction of errors toward a more efficient personal functioning. It was for the possibility of genuine virtue, and genuine virtue, in his sense, required that the person doing the virtuous thing actually knew what they were doing and why, all the way down without self-deception operating quietly in the foundations. Jung's demand for shadow work carries the same insistence. Not that one become darker or more comfortable with darkness, but that the darkness one contains be seen clearly enough that it can be worked with rather than simply acted out. What comes after shadow recognition in the movement of individuation is not simpler, it is deeper. Among the figures that Jung found waiting inside the psyche, beyond the shadow, further into the interior, was what he called the anima in a man and the animus in a woman. These are the contrasexual inner figures, the feminine aspects of a man's psyche, the masculine aspects of a woman's. And the task they present is more subtle than the shadow's task, because the shadow is at least recognizable as a version of oneself, however unwelcome, while the anima or animus has the quality of genuine otherness, something inside that does not feel like the self, that seems to come from a different direction entirely, and that makes itself known primarily through the feeling tones and instinctive responses and creative impulses that arrive from somewhere below the deliberate organization of the conscious personality. The difficulty begins when this inner figure is not recognized as inner, when the qualities belonging to the anima, the depth, the feeling, the sorrow that carries its own kind of beauty, the capacity for receptivity that is not passivity, remain unacknowledged in a man. They do not disappear, they are projected outward. They appear in the woman or women he is drawn toward with an intensity that has something slightly larger than the person in front of him in it. He falls in love, over and over, with a quality he is carrying in himself, but cannot yet see there. The woman across the table is real. She is also carrying something that belongs to the man's own inner life, and until he begins to reclaim it, the relationship must bear a weight no external relationship is designed to hold. The philosophical claim here is not merely psychological, it is an argument about the conditions of genuine encounter. A person who relates to another primarily through the lens of their own unacknowledged inner figures is not, in the fullest sense, relating to the other person at all. They are relating to a projection, to a screen onto which the contents of their own unconscious have been thrown, sometimes luminously, sometimes with the distorting force of everything they have never allowed themselves to be. The integration of the anima or animus does not end relationship. It makes it possible in a different way, the way that genuine encounter requires the other person to be seen as something other than a mirror. This is the strand of individuation that touches most directly on the question of creative life. The anima, as Jung encountered it in the work of writers and artists, and in the dreams of his patients, has a particular relationship to creative activity, to the willingness to enter territory that is not yet organized, to receive what arrives from below conscious intention, to allow the work to know something the worker has not yet consciously formulated. The man who has no access to this dimension of himself will tend toward a certain kind of rigidity in his work, a competence without surprise, a finish that has never allowed itself to be unsettled. Something is missing from the work, and the absence has a quality to it, even if the work cannot say what it lacks. The integration Jung asked of people in this stage was not the dissolution of the conscious personality into its opposite. A man does not become feminine. A woman does not become masculine. The integration is more like a conversation that begins, an ongoing negotiation between the known territory of the ego and the genuinely other terrain of the inner contrasexual figure, in which neither entirely determines the outcome, and in which the conversation itself becomes one of the most sustaining and productive relationships available to the person living it. All of this, the shadow encounter, the anima or animus integration, the long and often indirect deepening of honest self-knowledge, moves, in Jung's account of individuation, towards something he called the self. And the self, in this context, requires some care with language, because it is not the self of ordinary usage. It is not the personality, or the history, or the current ambitions of the person using the word. It is something much larger. Jung understood the self as the central archetype of the whole psyche, the encompassing totality of everything conscious and unconscious that constitutes the full range of who a person is. If the ego is the center of consciousness, the self is the center of the entire psyche, conscious and unconscious taken together. The ego did not make the self. The ego lives within it, serves it, is oriented toward it, the way a planet is oriented toward its sun, not diminished by that orientation, but made coherent by it, held in a gravitational relationship that is the condition of its own stable motion. Spinoza, in the 17th century, had written about substance, the single infinite self-caused ground that underlies and contains all particular things, each of which is an expression of the whole, rather than a separate item within a collection. The individual human being, for Spinoza, was a modification of substance, not separate from it, but particular within it, finite, but continuous with the infinite. Jung's self occupies a structurally analogous position within the domain of the psyche. It is not a goal to be achieved or a destination to be arrived at. It is what one already is at the deepest level of what one is, the organizing principle that has been present from the beginning, directing the pressure of the psyche toward its own fullest expression, whether or not the conscious personality has any awareness of this direction. This is why individuation cannot be understood as a program or a self-improvement project in the ordinary sense. One does not acquire the self the way one acquires a skill or a qualification. One moves toward it, circles it, encounters its influence in moments of unusual clarity or rightness, feels its absence in the particular interior cold that no amount of external success has ever quite managed to dispel. The movement is real, the distance it covers is real, but the destination is not a place one arrives at and then inhabits from a position of completion. It is more like learning to hear a note that has always been sounding. The tension that drives the whole arc of individuation, the tension from which the movement never escapes, and toward which it is always, in some sense, oriented, is the tension between the persona and the call of the self. The persona was built for good reasons. It works. It has served the person who built it through decades of necessary adaptation and careful social management. And yet, at some point, for many people, it begins to feel not wrong, exactly, but insufficient, not false, but tight. The mask that was a reasonable accommodation has become something that is gently, persistently, quietly narrowing the available air. Soren Kierkegaard, in the 19th century, had understood this tension with a precision that still carries weight. In the pages of Asterisk, either slash or asterisk, Kierkegaard had described the aesthetic mode of life and the ethical mode of life as the two ordinary registers of human self-understanding, the life organized around pleasure and experience, and the life organized around duty and social expectation. Both of these are modes of the persona in Jung's sense. They are arrangements of the self in relation to an external framework. What Kierkegaard was reaching toward, with a difficulty and an urgency that made the reaching visible, was a third mode, which he called the religious stage, though what he meant by that word was closer to inwardness than to doctrine. The unconditional commitment to what one most essentially is, made from a position that cannot be derived from social consensus or cultural inheritance. Jung's individuation points towards something similar. The call of the self is not a social call. It does not arrive as a recommendation from outside, as an option among options, as a project one undertakes when circumstances permit. It arrives with a different quality, insistent, patient, present in the disquiet that surfaces when a person's life has become entirely comfortable, and they notice, without fully naming it, that comfort and meaning are not the same thing. The image Jung kept returning to, and that the process keeps returning to in the lives of people who have genuinely entered it, is that of a spiral, not a straight road from a worse place to a better one, not a ladder ascending through identifiable stages. A spiral, which means that the same territory is revisited, but at greater depth. The same fundamental questions come back. The same points of resistance appear again, in different forms, wearing different faces. What changes is the depth from which they are being met, and the quality of honesty brought to bear on them, which increases not by effort alone, but by the accumulated willingness to have kept returning, rather than to have turned aside. This has a specific implication for the way individuation relates to time. It is not a young person's project, or not primarily. Jung was fairly direct about this. The first half of life has its own work to do, and that work is not the work of individuation in the deep sense. It is the work of building, adapting, establishing, of making the structure that will eventually need to be questioned. The questioning and the long, honest inquiry that follows it belongs to the second half. It is the work the psyche presses toward when the external structures are in place, and the questions that external success has deferred begin to resurface with an insistence they did not quite have before. This is not to say that nothing of individuation happens early, or that the process has a fixed schedule. It is to say that the deepest demands of the process tend to arrive when the persona has been built and its limitations have begun to make themselves known, when there is something real to question and enough experience behind the questioning to make the inquiry more than theoretical. The person who has lived long enough to have built something and who has begun honestly to feel the tightness of it, that person is in a position the process has been waiting for. The shadow work does not end. The conversation with the inner figures does not conclude. The orientation toward the self does not stabilize into a fixed achievement. What the continuing of the process produces is not completion, but something else, a quality of relationship to one's own interior that is less governed by surprise and more capable of honest response. A gradual decrease in the amount of psychic energy consumed by what is being pushed away and refused and unacknowledged. A corresponding increase in what becomes available for genuine attention and genuine action. The philosopher who held something close to this position before the vocabulary of depth psychology had given it the form Jung would eventually give it was Aristotle, in the final books of the Nicomachean Ethics not in the doctrine of entelechy alone, but in the broader account of what a flourishing human life is and how it is achieved. Aristotle had understood virtue not as the following of rules, but as the formation of character, a long, slow, irreversible shaping of who the person becomes through consistent action practiced over time until the virtuous response is no longer effortful, but natural, which is to say, until the person has become someone for whom this kind of response is simply what they do. Individuation is not Aristotle's virtue formation, but it shares with it the insistence that the person who emerges from the process is genuinely different from the person who entered it, not corrected, not improved in some external sense, but actually changed in the interior organization of who they are and how they meet what arrives. There is a quality of courage that individuation requires, and Jung did not minimize this. The shadow encounter asks for honesty of a kind that is genuinely uncomfortable. The anima or animus integration requires a willingness to acknowledge something in oneself that the carefully maintained identity has spent years not acknowledging. The orientation toward the self asks the ego to accept a relationship to something that is larger than it and that it did not create and cannot fully understand. None of this is the courage of dramatic action. It is the quieter and perhaps harder courage of sustained honest attention, the willingness to keep looking at what is actually there, rather than at the more comfortable version of it. The moral seriousness of this is real, and it points towards something well understood, that genuine attention is among the rarest and most demanding of human capacities, and that its opposite, the refusal to see what is actually present, the preference for the version of things that requires least from the viewer, is not a neutral choice. It has consequences. The shadow that is not acknowledged does not simply remain in place. It acts. It influences behavior, perception, and relationship from below the threshold of awareness, with none of the regulation that awareness would make possible. But the seriousness of this claim should not be heard as accusation. Jung was not a moralist in the ordinary sense. He was not interested in assigning blame or producing guilt. He was interested in what actually happens in a psyche over the course of a life, and in what conditions allow a life to move toward its deepest available form of expression, rather than to spend itself in the management of what it has refused to know about itself. The difference between these two is not a difference between good people and bad ones. It is a difference in direction, and direction can change. The image that Jung associated with the self across many different symbolic systems and in the dreams of many different patients was circular, the center that holds, the point around which everything else is organized without dominating it. The mandala, which appears spontaneously in the work of people who have never heard the word, circles within circles, quaternity, the sense of something gathered. Jung was careful about what he claimed for this. He did not claim to have discovered a new God or a new metaphysics. He claimed to have observed in the material of the psyche a structural tendency toward integration, toward the gathering of the scattered parts of a life into a pattern that the scattered parts alone could not produce. What the ego can know of the self is limited. This is not a deficiency of the ego, but the correct account of its position. The ego is the part of the psyche that knows itself. The self is the whole of which the ego is a part. The relationship is not one of subordination in the sense of diminishment. It is more like the relationship between a particular melody and the harmonic structure that makes the melody possible. The melody is real, is itself, is the thing one actually hears, and at the same time it belongs to something larger that it neither contains nor fully understands. The moments in which this relationship becomes briefly palpable, in dreams of unusual luminosity, in moments of creative work, when the work seems briefly to know more than the worker, in encounters with nature or music or silence that produce a quality of stillness one did not expect and cannot quite explain. These are what Jung called numinous experiences, not supernatural events, not proofs of anything. Moments in which the ego becomes briefly aware that it is not alone in the territory it occupies, that there is something else here, patient and large and old, with a direction of its own. And the process of individuation is in some sense the slow, patient work of developing a relationship to that something, of learning to listen to what it indicates without being overwhelmed by it, of building an ego strong enough to hold the encounter without collapsing into it or fleeing from it, of allowing the life to be informed by a center it depends on but did not make. That work does not complete. The road extends beyond wherever the walker has reached, not because the process fails, not because the person who undertakes it has not done enough, but because the process is not the kind of thing that completes. It is the kind of thing that continues, and the continuing of it is its form. A life in which the questions are still being asked, in which the interior inquiry has not stopped, and the movement toward the deepest available version of oneself has not settled into a fixed conclusion. That is not a life that has fallen short. That is the shape this kind of life takes. The road continues, the walker walks, and somewhere behind, on the ground already covered, the questions that seemed most urgent have quieted into something else, not answered, but held differently, carried with less strain, alive in the way that only things that have been genuinely lived with can be alive. And somewhere ahead, at whatever distance, the same questions wait again, in new forms, wearing new faces, asking with the patient insistence of everything that has not yet been fully met. The walker moves, the road extends, that continuing is not a sign of failure. It is the very form that this kind of life takes, and it asks nothing more for now than the willingness to take the next step, and the next, and to find in that simple continuing movement something that is enough. Jung alone at his stone tower on the upper lake, on a winter evening, the kind that arrives early in that part of Switzerland and settles without ceremony, the sky going the color of old pewter above the water, and the water going still beneath it. The fire had been lit, the lamp was on, and in his lap lay an alchemical text, not a philosophical treatise, but a working manual, the kind written by men who believed they were doing something practical, who believed that if they applied the right heat to the right material in the right sequence, the substance before them would undergo a genuine transformation. Jung had been reading these texts for years by this point. He had followed them through their serpents and their suns, their black stages and their white, their references to a king who must drown and a queen who must be rescued, and a marriage that can only happen in a sealed vessel, away from ordinary air. And on this particular evening, something that had been gathering at the edge of his attention for a long time moved quietly to the center. He was not reading about lead and mercury. He understood this now with a clarity that felt less like a discovery than like the final settling of something already known. The alchemist in the medieval workshop, surrounded by retorts and crucibles and the controlled breath of a bellows, believed himself to be conducting an operation on matter. He believed the transformation was happening in the vessel on the bench before him. But what Jung saw, reading these texts by lamplight on the shore of the upper lake, was that the true work was happening in the other direction entirely. The transformation the alchemist was describing, the dissolving, the purifying, the slow reddening toward gold, was a map of something the alchemist had not known how to name. The operation on matter was real to the alchemist, and the map was real too. It was simply a map of the wrong territory, or rather, it was a map of the right territory, drawn by someone who did not know he was drawing it. There is a word that comes from the tradition Jung was reading, projection. It carries the idea that what we cannot acknowledge in ourselves, we place outside ourselves. We see it in the world around us, in other people, in substances, in situations, without knowing that we have placed it there. Ludwig Feuerbach had used this word to describe what he believed humanity had done with its highest qualities, projected them outward onto a god, and then knelt before what it had made, not recognizing its own face in the image. Jung had read Feuerbach. He understood the argument, but what interested Jung was not demystification. He was not trying to dissolve the alchemist's practice by explaining it away. He was trying to understand what the practice revealed, what contents had been projected, how they were organized, and what it would mean to withdraw the projection, not in order to disenchant the world, but to return to oneself what had never stopped belonging there. The alchemist working in his medieval workshop did not know he was mapping the interior. He was sincere. He worked with patience and care. He recorded his failures and returned to the material. And in returning, in trying again, in sustaining attention over months and years on the slow changes of the substance before him. In all of this, he was doing something that Jung recognized from his clinical work, from his own interior practice, from the long watching of what happens when a person stays honestly present to the process of change unfolding within them. The alchemist was individuating without knowing it. The operation was real, only the name of the territory had been wrong. Jung drew the lamp a little closer. Outside, the lake was dark. The text in his lap continued its descriptions of sulfur and salt and mercury, of a green lion drinking the sun, of a hermaphrodite figure holding court in a garden where the trees bore fruit that could not be eaten. These images were not puzzles to be decoded. They were not allegories requiring a key. They were something closer to what a dream does. They moved, they surprised, they pointed. And they pointed in the same direction that certain dreams always pointed, toward a center, toward something whole, toward a warmth that the work was slowly approaching without ever quite arriving at in a single operation. There is a way of reading a symbol that keeps it at arm's length, that treats it as a code for something else, something more literal, that could be stated plainly if the symbol were simply set aside. Jung had argued against this way of reading for most of his professional life. A symbol, in the sense he intended, is not a concealment. It is not a disguise over a simpler content. It is the only available way of pointing at something that cannot yet be said directly, something at the edge of what consciousness has so far been able to hold. The alchemical image of the king who must drown is not code for the death of the ego, a concept one could simply name and be done with. The image carries something the concept alone does not carry. It has weight, it has temperature. It moves in the imagination in a particular way that the abstraction does not. And it is in that movement, in the specific felt quality of the image, as the mind holds it, that the meaning actually resides. Hans-Georg Gadamer, working much later and in a very different tradition, would describe the encounter with a text as a fusion of horizons, the horizon the text brings and the horizon the reader brings, meeting and expanding each other without either one simply consuming the other. Jung had not read Gadamer, but what he was doing with these alchemical texts was something structurally similar. He was not bringing the text to confirm what he already knew. He was bringing his own long attention to the interior, meeting the alchemist's long attention to the exterior, and finding in that meeting something neither perspective contained alone. The horizon of the medieval workshop and the horizon of the modern consulting room were expanding into each other, and the territory that opened between them was larger than either one had mapped. The method Jung had developed for working with dreams followed a similar logic. In the consulting room, when a patient described a dream, the conventional analytic instinct was to follow the associations away from the image, to ask what the dream figure reminded the patient of, what personal memory it touched, where in the patient's history the emotion that accompanied it had first been felt. This method treated the image as a starting point for a journey into the personal past. Jung had used it and had found it useful and had found it insufficient. There was something in the dream image itself, in its particular quality, its precise configuration of detail, that the personal association moved away from rather than toward. Following associations was a way of translating the image into familiar language, but the image had not appeared in order to say something familiar. It had appeared in order to say something the waking mind had not yet managed to say, which meant the waking mind's familiar categories were precisely what needed to be held in suspension. The method he developed instead was a staying close, a deliberate return to the dream image, a refusal to leave it, a practice of enriching what was already there rather than departing from it. If a patient dreamed of a hooded figure standing at the edge of a forest, Jung did not ask what hooded figures had meant to the patient as a child. He asked what a hooded figure meant everywhere, in the mythology of death and passage, in the figures at the margins of classical friezes, in the mediating figures of folk tales from India and Scandinavia and West Africa and ancient Greece, all of whom stood at thresholds, all of whom presided over crossings, all of whom carried the particular combination of authority and concealment that this dream figure carried. He called this amplification, not the amplification of the personal, but the amplification of the image itself, the gathering of parallel material from the long symbolic life of the human species, so that the dream could be heard in the full register of what it was actually saying. This was not a departure from rigor, it was a different kind of rigor. The alchemists' claim that sulfur and mercury combine to produce gold is either true or false by empirical standards, and alchemical chemistry eventually showed it was false. But the claim that a dream image of dissolution and darkening belongs to a widely distributed symbolic grammar of endings before renewal is not a chemical claim. It is a claim about the structure of the human imagination and how that structure organizes itself in moments of deep inner change. And it is a claim one can examine by looking at the dreams, by looking at the myths, by looking at the images that recur across cultures with the kind of structural consistency that cannot be explained by simple borrowing from one source to another. The descent was one of these recurring forms. It appeared in Sumerian narrative, in the Greek underworld that Odysseus visits at the edge of the world, in the shamanic traditions of Siberia, where the practitioner goes beneath the earth in a specific practiced way, in Dante moving downward through concentric circles of fire toward a center he has not yet understood, in the medieval vision literature where the soul travels through darkness before arriving at light. The descent motif in a dream carried this grammar with it, whether the dreamer had ever read a word of mythology or not. A staircase going down, another landing, the darkness below, neither empty nor hostile, but full of a waiting that has a quality of depth to it. The dreamer moving not with terror, but with a slow, reluctant attention, following something they cannot name. This image, in all its variations, is pointing at the same thing, not a narrative about the afterlife, not a cosmological claim about what is below the earth, but a description of what inner life feels like when consciousness turns toward what it has not yet faced and begins, slowly, to move toward it. Jung drew the lamp closer still. The alchemical text described the nigredo, the blackening, the first stage of the work, the stage in which the material must be allowed to decompose before anything new can begin. It was not a pleasant stage, the alchemical tradition agreed. The color was black because something was dying. The smell was sulfurous. The material in the vessel looked at this stage like something ruined. But the tradition was equally insistent that the nigredo was necessary, that the decomposition was the beginning of purification, that there was no path to the gold that did not go through this color first. And Jung, who had read the dreams of many patients moving through their own interior decompositions, who had undergone his own in the years he had spent alone with the Red Book, recognized the territory. The blackening was real. It was the beginning of something rather than the end. Then the albedo, the whitening, a clarification, not yet arrival, but a new kind of clarity, a cleaner light than the one that had been present before the blackening. Something unnecessary had been removed. Not everything, not the final unnecessary things, but enough that the light in the vessel changed character. The alchemical texts describe this stage with images of washing, of silver, of the moon, pale, reflective, receiving light rather than generating it. A consciousness that has been through the blackening and has not turned away from it arrives at something cooler and more honest than the confidence it started with. It knows less than it thought, and in that knowing less, it sees more clearly. And then, over time, the rubed, the reddening, the warmth returning to the material, but a different warmth from the one that had been present at the beginning, not the unconscious heat of the original conflict, but something that had been through the cold and come back changed. The alchemical texts associated this stage with blood, with fire, with the sun, with the king returning from his drowning, with the marriage that had been prepared for through all the preceding operations. It was not described as a permanent state. The texts did not claim that once the rubedo arrived, Nothing further would be needed. The work would continue. But something in the work had reached a place it had not been before, and the quality of the light in the vessel was different now, warmer, more integrated, less at war with itself. What the alchemists had been mapping, without knowing they were mapping it, was the movement of the psyche through its own process of self-organization. And the maps they had drawn, in their serpents and their kings and their marriages and their colors and their stages, were astonishingly precise, not because the alchemists had understood psychology in any modern sense, but because the process they were conducting in their workshops had been accompanied by an interior process that their images had captured without intention as a form of parallel notation. A scarab beetle is a small, dark, rounded insect of the family Scarabaeidae. In ancient Egypt, it was associated with the sun god Ra and with the idea of resurrection. The scarab that rolls its ball of dung across the sand was an image of the sun rolling across the sky, and the image carried with it the deeper suggestion of something being moved from darkness toward light by a force that operates with simple, persistent intention. Jung had known about the scarab's symbolic resonance for many years. He had encountered it in the Egyptian material and in the broader symbolic grammar of death and renewal that recurs across the ancient world. And then, in his consulting room in Kusnacht, something happened that he could not set aside and could not fully explain, and that he spent considerable thought trying to describe without either inflating it into a supernatural claim or reducing it into something that would make it disappear. A patient had been describing a dream. The dream had contained a golden scarab, a scarab made of gold, given to her in the dream by a figure she did not recognize. She was describing this dream in a way that suggested she did not think much of it, that she was offering it almost apologetically, the way one offers something one suspects will not be found useful. And as she described it, Jung heard something at the window behind him, a soft, repeated sound, the sound of something tapping against the glass. He turned. At the window, on the outside, was a flying insect pressing itself against the pane. He opened the window and caught it. It was a scarab beetle, a member of the family closest to the scarab in the Central European fauna, golden-green in color, the largest insect of its kind to be found in that latitude. Both of them went still. There was a quality to the silence that followed that Jung did not try to explain through causation. The beetle had not been caused by the dream. The dream had not been caused by the beetle. The two events, one interior, one exterior, had arrived together in a way that the rational framework available to him could not account for by the usual means. He called this synchronicity, an acausal meaningful coincidence, two events joined not by cause and effect, but by meaning, by a kind of resonance between inner and outer that suggested something he could only point toward rather than name directly. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz had argued in his doctrine of pre-established harmony that the inner life of a monad and the outer world of extended matter never causally interact but run in a kind of perfect correspondence, like two clocks set to the same time by a maker who wound them once and has not touched them since. Jung had read Leibniz. The idea of a correspondence without causation was not entirely foreign to the philosophical tradition. What Jung was describing with synchronicity was something in the same general territory, the suggestion of a common ground between psyche and matter that he called the unus mundus, the one world, the underlying fabric from which both inner event and outer event arise, and in which they can, in certain conditions, arrive together in a way that carries meaning. This was not a supernatural claim. It was a philosophical one, offered with genuine tentativeness and genuine seriousness, held at exactly the limit of what the evidence allowed him to say. The Cartesian tradition had separated mind and matter so thoroughly that for 3 centuries the dominant philosophical project had been to explain how they could interact at all, how a thought could move a body, how a sensation could produce a feeling, how the inner and the outer could be said to belong to the same world. Descartes had placed them on opposite sides of a wall he could not see over. The wall had held long enough to feel like the natural order of things. What synchronistic experiences pressed against was not the wall itself, so much as the assumption that the wall was all there was. They pressed against it not with force, but with simply showing up, with arriving in their quiet, specific, entirely ordinary way, in moments when the separation they were said to exemplify had become temporarily unavailable. Jung held the beetle in his hand for a moment. He showed it to the patient. He placed it in her palm and let her look at it. Then he set it down. The session continued. The rational framework reassembled itself around the moment, the way water reassembles itself around a stone that has been dropped into it. But the stone had been dropped, and the quality of the conversation after that moment was different. Something in the patient had shifted. Some rigidity that had made her progress slow had become briefly permeable. The image she had dismissed had been confirmed, by means no one had arranged, as worth taking seriously. The mandala had arrived in a similar way, not as a concept but as a practice that preceded the concept by years. Jung had drawn circles each morning during the period of the Red Book, filling them with forms that emerged from something he could not quite account for by deliberate intention. The circles organized themselves. They returned to symmetry even when he had not planned symmetry. They contained forms that recurred in specific arrangements, a center, a fourfold structure, a border that distinguished inside from outside, with a quality that felt, as he drew it, less like a limit than like a definition. He did not know when he began drawing them that these same circular forms appeared in Hindu and Buddhist ritual art, in the sand mandalas of Tibetan practice, in the rose windows of Gothic cathedrals, in the drawings produced by patients in crisis who had never heard of any of these traditions. He discovered this gradually, over years of research, and the discovery changed what the drawings meant to him. They were not decoration. They were not expressive in the sense of expressing a personal aesthetic. They were something more like a spontaneous record of a certain kind of psychic event, the event in which the psyche, under sufficient pressure, turns toward its own organizing principle, and begins, in whatever medium is available, to make that principle visible. The center of a mandala is not empty. It is full of a particular kind of presence, the presence of whatever in the psyche functions as a center, as the organizing depth from which conscious life is generated. The Tibetan tradition knew this. The Hindu tradition knew this. The Hindu tradition knew this. The medieval Christian tradition knew this in the geometry of its great windows, even when it named the center by a different name. And the patients in Jung's consulting room knew it in their bodies, in the hands that drew these forms without knowing why, in the feeling of rightness that the completed circle produced in them, a feeling of having arrived somewhere, briefly, that they had always been trying to find. The word for this center was self, not the small daily self of social interaction and deliberate choice, but the encompassing principle that contains conscious and unconscious both, and gives to the whole its direction, its depth, its sense of being oriented towards something the ego cannot fully see. Baruch Spinoza had described a substance that contains all particular expressions without being reducible to any of them, the ground of being from which individual things arise and to which they remain, in some sense always already connected. Jung's self occupies an analogous position within the domain of psychic life. It is not a thing among other things. It is the encompassing depth that the ego lives within and cannot fully comprehend from its position at the center of consciousness, the way an island cannot, from its own shore, comprehend the ocean it stands in. The mandala was the symbol the self produced when it needed to become visible. It was not the only symbol. The hero, the wise old man, the great mother, the child of unusual significance, the stone, the fire, the tree rooted both above and below, all of these were ways the self made itself available to consciousness in forms consciousness could hold. But the mandala was perhaps the most direct. The circle with a center is the simplest possible image of a whole that is organized around something rather than simply bounded. It is an image the hand can draw in a single gesture. It is an image the eye takes in as a unity, and in that taking in, something in the psyche that has been scattered recognizes itself, recognizes the center it belongs to, the circumference that defines it, the quiet organizing principle that has been there all along beneath the noise of ordinary waking life. Jung closed the alchemical text. Outside, the lake was entirely dark now. The fire had settled to a steady low burning, the kind of fire that no longer needs tending, that has found its own pace and will hold it for a long time. He had been sitting for several hours without fully noticing the time pass, a quality of absorption he had come to associate with this particular kind of work, the work of reading images for what they contained, rather than for what they could be made to mean. There was a difference. Making an image mean something was a way of controlling it, of keeping it within the territory of what consciousness had already mapped. Reading an image for what it contained was a different practice, a practice of holding still, of allowing the image to continue its movement in the imagination, rather than stopping it with interpretation, of following where it led, rather than leading it somewhere oneself. The guide figure that appeared in so many dreams, at the edge of a landscape, at the opening of a passage, at the threshold of a territory the dreamer had not yet entered, was the imaginal form this quality took when the unconscious needed to communicate it. The guide does not explain. The guide does not provide a map. The guide is simply present, with a quality of authority that does not require credentials, and turns toward the territory ahead, and waits. And what the waiting communicates is something that all the symbolic grammar of the unconscious communicates, in its various forms and figures and recurring motifs, that there is somewhere to go, and that the capacity to go there is already present, and that what is needed is not more understanding, but more willingness to follow. The stone tower at Bollingen was itself a mandala of a kind, built in stages over decades, each edition corresponding to something in Jung's inner life that had reached the point of requiring a physical form. He had built it with his own hands. He had carved inscriptions into the stone. He had arranged the rooms in a specific way, certain rooms without electricity, certain rooms reserved for practices he conducted in silence, the space organized according to an interior logic that was not architectural in any conventional sense, but was genuine. The building was not a symbol of the self in the way that a diagram is a symbol of an idea. It was a materialization of the same process the alchemists had been conducting in their workshops, a working out in external matter of an interior transformation that needed a physical correlate in order to be fully real. The tower was Jung's vessel. He was the material and the alchemist both. Late in his life, looking back at the long movement of his work and the long accumulation of the images he had followed, the dreams, the mandalas, the alchemical stages, the guide figures, the synchronistic arrivals of meaning in apparently external events, he described it as an attempt to understand the language the depths speak, not to translate that language into something else, something more manageable, something that could be stored in a concept and filed and referred to later, but to learn the language itself, to become gradually fluent in the grammar of images, to follow the descent motif when it appeared without insisting it lead somewhere already known, to receive the guide figure's patient invitation without demanding to know the destination in advance. The rubido was not a final state. The alchemical texts, read carefully, were honest about this. They described it as a warmth that becomes perceptible in the work, not an arrival at a permanent condition, but a quality of the process itself, a warmth the material begins to carry that was not there before, that indicates something has been integrated that was previously at war with itself. It is not announced, it does not arrive with clarity or force. It arrives the way a fire makes itself known in a dark room, not by declaring itself, but by the quality of the light it gives off, by the change in the temperature of the air, by the shadows it produces on the far wall that have a depth and a movement the room did not have before. The alchemical image of the rubedo is not an allegory for happiness or for the end of difficulty. It is an image for a specific quality of maturation, the quality of having been through something and having allowed that something to change what one carries. The blackening had happened, the cold clarity of the whitening had followed, and now, in the reddened stage, the warmth of integration was present, not as a destination reached and secured, but as a quality the ongoing process had begun to carry. The work would continue, the alchemist would return to the bench, the dreams would continue arriving, the images would continue moving in the imagination with their characteristic patience and their refusal to be reduced to something smaller than themselves. Jung sat for a while after he closed the book, the fire low and steady, the lake invisible in the dark beyond the window. The meaning of the alchemical images he had spent decades reading was not a conclusion that could be set down in a sentence and carried away. It was something that had to remain in the form it had come in, as image, as warmth, as the felt sense of a territory that extended well beyond what any single mind had fully charted. The symbol was the knowing, the image was the thought, and the thought held in this form continued to move in the dark with the slow patience of something that has no particular relationship to human urgency or human time, that has been here long before this evening and will be here long after the fire has gone cold and the lamp has been turned down and the stone tower stands empty beside the still water of the upper lake. Meaning, when it arrives in this way, not as a declaration, not as a clarification that makes everything plain, but as a warmth that becomes briefly perceptible in the quality of the work, indirectly, through image, through the specific temperature of a dream image held long enough, through the odd arriving together of an inner event and an outer one, in a moment when the wall between them seemed, for a few seconds, thinner than it is usually supposed to be. It cannot be directly seized. It dissolves when approached too quickly, the way a memory dissolves when grasped for rather than allowed. What remains is the image still moving, the fire still going, the window still dark, and somewhere in the space between the image and the one who holds it, something that has always been there, waiting with the particular patience of everything that does not need to be found in order to have been present all along. Jung was old by the time he found the kind of stillness that does not need to be maintained. The 1950s had come and brought with them a quieter life, fewer patients, fewer seminars, fewer arguments to enter and defend. At Bullingen, the stone tower he had built by hand on the upper shore of the lake, he would sit in the mornings on the terrace with the water below him and the long Swiss light moving across the mountains on the far side. His hands rested open on his knees. This was not the pose of a man who had finished thinking. It was the pose of a man who had stopped needing to distinguish between thinking and not thinking, because the years had blurred the line between the two into something he could live inside without effort. The intellectual life behind him was not concluded. It had simply changed its form. What had once arrived as urgency, the need to name, to defend, to build a case that would stand, had slowed into something more like accompaniment. The ideas were still moving in him the way water moves in deep rock, not with force, but with patience and with a kind of confidence that it will eventually reach where it is going. It is worth staying with that image for a moment. A long life of thinking does not produce rest because the thinking stops. It produces rest because the thinker has been shaped by what they followed long enough to carry it without strain. Jung had followed his questions into territories that had no established maps, had built the maps himself, and had been wrong about some of what he drew, and right about enough to make the drawing worth doing. Now the map rested in him, and what he could see from the terrace at Bullingen on a morning in his late 70s was that he had not been making the journey alone. The philosophers had always been there. Some of them he had read as a young student in Basel, sitting in rooms that smelled of old paper and winter, not yet knowing what he was looking for, but recognizing in certain sentences something that reached toward the same territory he already suspected was inside him. Kant was one of these. Not the Kant of textbook summaries, reduced to 3 critiques and a categorical imperative, but the Kant of the fundamental epistemological turn, the Kant who had looked at the question of what can be known and had drawn a line that changed the shape of everything that came after it. What Kant had argued in the long, careful architecture of the first critique was that the mind does not passively receive the world as it is. The mind brings structures to experience, structures of space, of time, of causation, and what appears to consciousness is always already organized by these structures. The thing in itself, the world as it exists independently of any perceiving mind, remains permanently out of reach. Not because the mind is weak or confused, but because this is simply the condition of experience. What can be known is always shaped by the knowing. Jung had encountered this argument in his student years, and what he felt upon reading it was not constraint. The limitation Kant described landed in him not as a wall to mourn, but as a kind of permission. If the thing in itself is inaccessible, then the honest domain of inquiry is not ultimate reality, but the structures of experience, the appearances, the patterns, the forms that consciousness actually encounters. A psychology of the psyche does not need to make metaphysical claims about what lies beyond the reach of experience. It only needs to describe, as carefully and honestly as possible, what actually appears within it. This was the philosophical ground on which Jung built everything. The archetypes were not claims about supernatural entities. The collective unconscious was not a doctrine about cosmic consciousness. They were descriptions of recurring patterns that appeared within psychological experience, consistent enough across cultures and centuries to suggest that something structural was producing them, even if the nature of that structure could not itself be directly known. Kant had given him the frame, and Jung had spent the rest of his life working within it, which is a different thing from being limited by it. The frame had edges, and Jung knew their location. And what he described was always what had appeared in the consulting room, in the patient's dream, in the images that surfaced in meditation and in fever, and in the long creative work of artists who had not intended to be psychologists. He was not making claims about what caused these appearances from the other side of experience. He was attending to the appearances themselves with the same care a naturalist brings to the observation of animals that have not yet been classified, noting what they do, when they appear, what they seem to be oriented toward, what they avoid. Schopenhauer had been a different kind of companion. Jung had read him early, with the intensity that only very young readers bring to a philosopher who seems to be describing something they already dimly know. The world, Schopenhauer had argued, is not fundamentally rational. Beneath the ordered surface of things, beneath the causes and reasons and explanations that satisfy the intellect, there is a blind, striving force he called the asterisk. Will, asterisk will, or drive, or hunger, without object or end, pushing all things forward without knowing why or where. This force is not benevolent. It is not oriented toward anything. It seeks, and in seeking produces suffering, because the seeking is never completed, and completion, if it arrived, would only reveal a new form of seeking waiting beneath it. Schopenhauer's conclusion was that the wisest response to this condition is renunciation, the gradual withdrawal of willing, the quieting of desire, the approximation, through art and asceticism and philosophy, of a state in which the blind drive no longer has its hands on the wheel. Jung had felt the truth of the description. He had recognized the blind drive in the clinical material, in the dreams of people who came to him, unable to stop repeating patterns of behavior that caused them obvious suffering, in the compulsive quality of the complexes he had been mapping since his early years at the Berg-Heltzli Clinic. Something was moving in the psyche that was not rational and not chosen, and Schopenhauer had named it with a precision that subsequent decades of academic psychology had not improved on. But Jung had not followed Schopenhauer to the conclusion. The same force that Schopenhauer had called blind, Jung had found to be, in certain conditions, capable of something more than repetition. The unconscious, when approached with patience and with what he called active imagination, a deliberate sustained attendance to what the interior produces, did not simply repeat itself. It developed, it moved, it seemed to carry within itself a directionality that was not imposed from without, but was somehow native to it, the way a river has a direction, not because anyone has told it which way to flow, but because the landscape has a shape that the water follows. Schopenhauer's will, imagined as a river running beneath the frozen surface of ordinary life, was powerful and directionless and ancient. Jung's revision of that image was small but consequential. The river was the same, but there was the possibility of a boat and of learning, through years of careful attention on the water, something of where the current was actually moving, not controlling it, not mastering it, but entering into a relationship with it that was more than passive endurance and less than the total renunciation Schopenhauer had prescribed. This was the difference between a philosophy that ends in quietism and a psychology that ends in engagement. It was not a small difference. Nietzsche stood at a more complicated angle. Jung had spent years with Nietzsche, not the Nietzsche of popular summary, the hammer-swinging prophet of will and power, but the Nietzsche of the actual sentences, which are more vulnerable and more uncertain than the reputation suggests. In the 1930s, Jung held a seminar in Zurich that ran for years, working through Asterix Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Asterix with a group of students who came back week after week because the conversation always found something it had not expected to find. Zarathustra is a book about a man who goes into solitude and returns with a teaching that no one is ready to hear. The teaching concerns the possibility of a human life genuinely lived from within, not from the inherited values of a culture, not from the approval of others, not from the fear of punishment or the hope of reward, but from something deeper that Nietzsche called the will to power, by which he did not mean domination over others, but something closer to the creative force of genuine self-expression, the energy that arises when a human being is actually being what they most fundamentally are. Jung had read this with recognition and with caution simultaneously. The recognition was easy. The account of living from within, of refusing to allow the persona, the social mask, the accommodated self, to substitute entirely for the more difficult interior self. This was close enough to what Jung meant by individuation that the resonance was immediate. But the caution was also easy, because Nietzsche's end was known, and what it illustrated in Jung's reading was a specific philosophical and psychological danger. Zarathustra had been overwhelmed, not by external forces, not by critics or enemies or the indifferent public, but by the very contents of the interior life he had been proclaiming. The transpersonal energies of the psyche, what Jung would call the archetypes, had risen in him to a pitch that his ego could not metabolize. He had been speaking not as a man, but as a vehicle for something larger, had confused the voice of the unconscious with the voice of the self, had lost the distinction between the person who has an experience and the content of the experience itself. In Jung's seminars, he described Nietzsche's fate, not with contempt or with dismissal, but with a careful, almost sorrowful attention, the attention one brings to a gifted person who went somewhere very deep and could not find the way back. The danger was real, and it was not unique to Nietzsche. Any honest engagement with the depths of the interior life carries some version of this risk, that what one encounters there will seem so much larger and more significant than the ordinary ego, that the ordinary ego will abandon its post and allow itself to be replaced. This is what Jung called inflation, the swelling of the ego with archetypal contents it has not actually earned or integrated, the confusion of a temporary powerful experience with a permanent condition of the self. The corrective, in Jung's view, was groundedness, the maintenance of the ego's humility in relationship to the larger forces it was encountering, the willingness to carry what had been found back into the ordinary life and to live with it there, where it would be tested by the actual conditions of daily existence and would either prove real or reveal itself as illusion. Nietzsche had not been grounded enough, or perhaps the structures of support available to him, philosophical tradition, close community, clinical understanding of what was happening to him, had not been sufficient for what he had encountered. Jung held both possibilities, and held them gently, without resolving them. The Gnostics occupied a different room in Jung's intellectual house, older, stranger, lit by a different kind of light. He had encountered them first through scholarly texts, and had found in their cosmological systems something that felt not ancient but immediate, as though the elaborate mythological structures they had built in the first centuries of the Common Era were maps of something he recognized from the consulting room. The Gnostics had told a story about the origin of things that was also a story about the condition of the individual soul. In the beginning, they said, there was light, an infinite, original fullness they called the asterisk pleroma. Asterisk, through a series of creative emanations, the light had spread outward and had eventually become scattered and fragmented, caught in the dense matter of the physical world, which was not the creation of the highest God, but of a lower power, a maker of limits. Everywhere in the material world there were sparks of that original light, each spark carrying within it an orientation toward return, a kind of homesickness for the fullness it had come from. The spark did not know what it was. It was embedded in matter, surrounded by the opacity of ordinary experience, and the only path back to its source was knowledge. Asterisk gnosis, asterisk, a direct inner knowing that was not belief, and not argument but recognition, the experience of understanding from the inside what one is and where one has come from. Jung had not been a Gnostic in any doctrinal sense. He had not believed in the literal truth of the cosmological architecture, the asterisk archons, asterisk, and the asterisk aeons, asterisk, and the divine asterisk, pleroma, asterisk above, but as images, as a language for something he had observed in the psychological domain. The Gnostic material had given him a vocabulary of extraordinary precision. The spark of light held within dense matter. This was the self, pressing from within the ordinary ego toward an expression it had not yet found. The opacity of the material world, this was the unconsciousness of the persona, the thickness of the adapted self that has forgotten what it was adapted away from. The asterisk gnosis, asterisk. This was the direct experiential knowing that came in moments of genuine psychological encounter, when something in the interior life made itself known, not as a theory, but as a felt recognition. In 1916, in the strange and fertile years after his rupture with Freud, and before he had fully mapped the territory he was moving through, Jung had written a short, strange text that he attributed to the Gnostic teacher Basilides of Alexandria. He called it the asterisk 7 sermons to the dead, asterisk. The dead who came to him in this text were the restless ones, the ones who had not found what they were looking for in their lives and had returned hoping to find it in the speaking. What they needed, the sermons told them, was not comfort or reassurance, but distinction, the ability to tell the difference between the principles that govern the interior life, the fundamental forces that are always at work beneath the surface of ordinary awareness. The asterisk pleroma asterisk, the sermon said, is the fullness where all opposites are reconciled and all distinctions dissolve. But the individual soul does not live in the asterisk pleroma asterisk. It lives in the world of distinctions, and its health depends not on dissolving back into undifferentiated fullness, but on learning to live with the tension of the opposites, to hold both darkness and light, both life and death, both fullness and emptiness, without collapsing the tension prematurely into a false resolution. This was the Gnostic contribution, translated into psychological terms, not escape from the tensions of existence, but a more honest and complete inhabitation of them. It was also, in a different register, close to what Kierkegaard had meant by the inward commitment that stands beyond the aesthetic and the ethical, not a doctrine to be adopted, but a way of being that has been arrived at through the full living of what came before it. William James had been working from a different starting point entirely, and had arrived at something Jung found useful in the same way one finds useful, an instrument that measures something other than what one has been measuring, and confirms that the territory has a shape independent of the tools used to map it. James had spent years collecting accounts of religious and mystical experience, not the formal doctrines of established traditions, not the theological arguments about the nature of God, but the actual first-person reports of ordinary people who had experienced something they could not explain within their ordinary frameworks. Conversion experiences, moments of oceanic unity, visitations of a presence that was not imaginary in any ordinary sense, and that left the person who encountered it permanently altered in the direction of greater openness, greater clarity, greater capacity for what James called the will to live. He had done this with the same careful, empirical attention he brought to everything, reading each account slowly, taking it seriously as data, asking not whether it corresponded to any established theological doctrine, but what its effects had been, what it had done to the life of the person who had undergone it. This was the pragmatic criterion, and it was not a dismissal of the experience's significance. It was a way of taking the experience seriously without having to settle questions about God, about consciousness, about the ultimate nature of things. That philosophy had not settled and was unlikely to settle by direct argument. Jung had read The Varieties of Religious Experience, with recognition and with gratitude. James had given philosophical respectability to a region of human experience that academic psychology of the time was largely ignoring or pathologizing. More than that, he had demonstrated a method that the reality of an inner experience could be assessed by its depth and its effects without requiring prior resolution of its metaphysical cause. A numinous experience is real as a psychological fact, regardless of what produced it from the other side of experience. Its reality is the reality of what it does to the life that undergoes it. This aligned precisely with what Jung had been doing in the consulting room for decades. The question he brought to a patient's dream or vision was never first a question about its objective truth. It was a question about its function, what it was doing in the economy of that particular life, what it was moving toward, what it seemed to want from the person who had received it. The experience was the datum. The metaphysics could wait, and probably always would. James had sat at his desk in Cambridge reading letters from people he would never meet, each letter describing something that had happened to them in a moment of unusual openness or extremity, a light that seemed to come from everywhere, a silence that was somehow full, a sense of being known by something larger than any person could be. He had treated each account with the same careful, genuinely curious attention he would give to any other significant fact about the world. Not credulity, not dismissal, the specific attention of a mind that has decided the world is more various and more strange than its ordinary categories can accommodate, and that this is not a problem to be corrected, but a condition to be inhabited with as much honesty as possible. Jung had made the same decision from a different angle at a different point in his life. The world of the psyche was larger than the map of consciousness could hold. The depths were real, and what appeared in them carried significance, even when, perhaps especially when, it did not fit the frameworks available for understanding it. This was not mysticism. It was the specific discipline of a mind that knows the boundary of what it can claim and stays within it, not from timidity, but from integrity. The long life of thinking does not make the questions smaller. It makes the questions more familiar, and familiarity is not the same as resolution. Jung knew this at Bollingen in the 1950s, sitting on the stone terrace, with the lake below him. The questions he had been living with for 60 years were still there. What is the psyche, and how deep does it go? What is the self, and what would it mean to actually move toward it, rather than simply to use the word? What remains of a person when the persona falls away, and is what remains something that can bear the weight of being inhabited? These questions had not been answered. They had been worked with, lived inside, approached from different angles in different decades, and something had accumulated around them. Not answers, but a quality of relationship. The same relationship a person has with a landscape they have walked through in many seasons, knowing that the knowing is always partial, and that this partiality is part of what makes the knowing worth continuing. Kant had given him the epistemological frame. Schopenhauer had named the blind force and suggested its management, and Jung had disagreed gently but consistently about what managing it could involve. Nietzsche had gone very deep and shown something about the risks of depth that mere caution could not have conveyed. The Gnostics had provided images of astonishing precision for something that more sober philosophical vocabularies could only approximate. James had confirmed that the empirical attitude and the openness to numinous experience were not contradictions, that a serious mind could hold both without resolving one into the other. Together they had not formed a system. Jung had been suspicious of systems, his own included. A system closes around what it contains and begins, almost immediately, to exclude the anomalies that do not fit its structure. And the anomalies are often exactly where the most important material is located. What these thinkers had provided was not a system but a company, a set of minds who had spent serious time in related territory and had left marks that helped a later traveler know, in the dark, that the ground had been walked before. There is something in that company which is itself a kind of argument, not a formal argument, not a set of premises leading to a conclusion, but the accumulated weight of serious people across many centuries finding their way to adjacent places by different roads. The consistency is not proof of anything, but it is not nothing either. It suggests that the territory they were moving through is real in some sense, that is not merely personal, not merely the projection of a single mind onto an empty landscape. The individuation process, in Jung's account, is not something that any one person completes. No one arrives. The self as the central archetype, the encompassing ground of what a person most deeply is, does not become fully transparent to the ego in the course of a single life. What happens, at best, is that the relationship between the ego and the self deepens over time, that the ego becomes more genuinely oriented toward the larger center it cannot fully comprehend, and that this orientation shows up not as a state of achievement, but as a quality of the life being lived. A person who has been in genuine relationship with their interior life for a long time does not necessarily know more, or understand more, or have resolved more questions. They have, perhaps, a different relationship to not knowing. The uncertainty that earlier in the life would have felt like a gap to be filled has become something more like an open space to be inhabited. The questions that once demanded answers have become, with time and with honest engagement, more like companions, things that walk alongside the life rather than blocking the road. This is what philosophical equanimity actually means when the word is used with any precision. Not the absence of difficulty, not the resolution of what is genuinely unresolved, but a quality of relationship to difficulty and to irresolution that has been arrived at through the actual work of staying with it, through the many seasons of walking the same territory from different angles and finding it always both familiar and new. The road of individuation is not a metaphor, and Jung was particularly attached to, but it does describe something accurately about the temporal structure of the process. It is walked in sequence. What one encounters at a later point depends on what was worked through at an earlier point, in the way that a landscape opens differently to someone who has crossed the first range of hills than it does to someone standing at the trailhead. The earlier work is carried in the body. It changes what is visible, and the road does not end. This is not a failure of the map. It is the nature of what is being walked. A person reaches the place they thought was the destination and finds that the road continues beyond it, through new territory that the earlier portions of the journey had not prepared them to imagine. This could be experienced as disappointment. It could also be experienced as the specific quiet pleasure of discovering that the world is larger than the plan, that what seemed like a conclusion was actually a landing, and that the view from the landing shows that there is more. Among all the things Jung carried from his long philosophical inheritance, this might be the one he returned to most often in his last years, that the process of genuine inner development does not converge on a point of completion. It deepens, it spirals. The same questions come back with more honesty. The same territories are revisited with more capacity to see what was there all along. The wisdom of the later years of a life, if it is genuinely wisdom rather than simply the quieting of energy, is the wisdom of someone who has been here before, in this questioning, in this uncertainty, in this particular form of the darkness, and has learned, through the sheer accumulation of time, that it is survivable, and more than survivable, that it has gifts that cannot be received any other way. The philosophers who accompanied Jung on this road had not all been comfortable. Kant had insisted on the limits of what could be known, which is not a comfortable insistence even when it is right. Schopenhauer had looked at the blind drive underlying human life and had not turned away from what he saw, which required a courage that his pessimistic reputation tends to obscure. Nietzsche had gone further than was safe, which is not something one can simply recommend, but which leaves behind it a record that serves others, a map of where the edges are, drawn by someone who crossed them. The Gnostics had made images of extraordinary interiority in the middle of a world that was largely not interested, had preserved in their elaborate cosmologies a genuine philosophical concern with the gap between what a person is and what they might become. James had demonstrated, quietly and with enormous patience, that the varieties of human experience are too various to be contained in any single theoretical framework, and that this is something to be curious about rather than afraid of. None of them had finished. That is the other thing Jung could see from the terrace at Bollingen, with the lake below him and the long light moving. None of the people who had helped him find his way had arrived anywhere final. Kant had left problems his students spent generations working on and had not resolved. Schopenhauer had reached his conclusion and had not convinced everyone, and had not expected to. Nietzsche had broken apart in the effort of what he was trying to do, and the effort itself had become part of what he left behind.